The most suspicious detail in Silo Season 3, Episode 7, might be the one sitting in the title. Radio. Because after what happened to Lucas and Kennedy, the radio may have become much more than a way for the Silos to talk to each other. It may be the reason Silo 1 could find them. Look at the sequence carefully. Juliet left Silo 18 earlier, crossed the poisoned world outside, and eventually reached Silo 17. She survived the trip. She wasn't immediately intercepted by whatever system is protecting the Silos. Then Lucas and Kennedy made a similar journey. They had the same basic objective. They had access to the same kind of protective equipment. They were traveling between the same silos. And they were attacked. That difference is where this theory starts. Because Lucas and Kennedy did something Juliet didn't. They transmitted. Once they were outside, they used the radio to communicate with Martha Walker back in Silo 18. That sounds completely harmless. If the radio is simply a communication device, there should be no reason for it to matter to the system controlling the silos. But if Silo 1 can detect radio transmissions, suddenly the sequence looks very different. A radio transmission gives away something extremely useful. A location. This isn't science fiction. Radio direction finding is a real technology. With the right equipment, a receiver can determine the direction a signal came from, and multiple receivers can be used to locate the transmitter. So imagine what that means inside the world of Silo. The silos already have a communications network. They have surveillance. They have systems capable of monitoring people across enormous underground structures. And Season 3 has been steadily showing us that the intelligence behind the silos can do far more than Bernard's generation understood. If Silo 1 has receivers positioned around the network, a transmission from outside could be almost like somebody turning on a beacon. The moment Lucas and Kennedy started talking, the system would have something to track. And that gives us a possible explanation for one of Episode 7's strangest sequences. They aren't simply attacked while traveling. They are attacked after establishing communication. That timing matters. Because Juliet had already proven that a person could leave Silo 18, survive the outside, and reach another silo. She had done the journey. She had even returned. Yet when Lucas and Kennedy attempted their own mission, something seemed to know where they were. That creates a very uncomfortable possibility. Maybe Silo 1 doesn't have to watch every person who leaves a silo. Maybe it only has to watch for the signals that reveal where those people are. And that would be much more efficient. Think about the problem Silo 1 is trying to solve. It doesn't necessarily need to monitor every square meter of the surface continuously. It needs to prevent people from discovering the other silos, communicating across them, and eventually organizing against whoever controls the system. A person walking silently through the outside world is difficult to track. A person carrying a radio and transmitting a signal is another matter. The signal is announcing itself. That could also explain why the radio has become increasingly important in the story. The silos were designed to isolate people. Communication between them is dangerous because information is dangerous. For generations, residents believed their silo was effectively alone. Even when radios existed, the average person had no reason to assume there was another community listening somewhere beyond the walls. Now, Juliet knows there are other silos. Martha knows there are other silos. Lucas knows. And the rebels are beginning to understand that the system is much larger than Silo 18. That makes radio communication one of the most dangerous technologies they could possibly use. There is another detail that makes this theory more interesting. Walker's radio isn't simply being used to talk across a room. The entire point is to establish contact beyond the normal boundaries of the silo. That means the moment the characters start asking, who else can hear this? We should also be asking, who else can locate it? Those are two completely different questions, and Silo 1 may have an answer to both. There is also a useful distinction between receiving and transmitting. Juliet's journey gives us a natural comparison. She could receive information through the equipment associated with the silo. She could see what the system wanted her to see, but she wasn't necessarily broadcasting her own location back into the network. Lucas and Kennedy were. That makes Episode 7 sequence feel almost like an experiment. Juliet demonstrates that crossing the outside is possible. Lucas and Kennedy demonstrate what happens when you try to do it while maintaining contact with Silo 18. And the result is brutal. The system finds them. Now, I don't think we can say Episode 7 has confirmed that radio transmissions are how Silo 1 tracks people. It hasn't. There are still other explanations. Silo 1 could have another method of detecting movement outside. The voice could have access to surveillance technology we haven't seen. The suits could contain something trackable. The outside environment itself could be monitored. The show has deliberately given us enough possibilities to keep this ambiguous. But the radio theory has one advantage. It explains why the radio matters specifically at this point in the story. And that is usually where Silo's best clues come from. A piece of technology becomes important because the characters start using it in a new way. There is also a bigger implication. If Silo 1 can locate a radio transmission, then the radios may have been dangerous for much longer than anyone realized. That could change how we interpret earlier communication between silos. Every time somebody transmitted a message, who was listening? Was Silo 1 simply allowing communication because it knew where the signal originated? Was the network designed to monitor those conversations? Could some of the strange information exchanged between silos have been deliberately permitted? And most importantly, could Silo 1 use the radio network to identify which silo is becoming a problem? Because that would make the radio a surveillance system disguised as a communication system. And suddenly, the title of this episode feels much more deliberate. There is one more piece of this theory that makes the timing especially suspicious. Look at what happened after Lucas and Kennedy were attacked. The system believed the problem had been dealt with. Then, near the end of the episode, communication comes back into the story. The voice on the radio says that the kids are safe, and Juliet immediately reacts to that information. That scene can be read in a very simple way. Kennedy survived and managed to make contact. But there is another possibility. What if the person speaking isn't the person Juliet thinks it is? The show has already established that the system controlling the silos can manipulate information. It can communicate with people. It can influence decisions. It can use knowledge that ordinary residents don't have. So if the radio is also being monitored, there is a potential second layer to that final transmission. The system may not only be able to hear the rebels, it may be able to speak through the same network. That would make the radio extremely dangerous in both directions. You can transmit your location, and somebody else can transmit information designed to change your behavior. That is exactly what happens at the end of the episode. Juliet is considering an extremely destructive course of action to protect her people. Then she receives a radio message. The message gives her a reason to stop. We don't yet know whether that voice is genuinely Kennedy. That's important, because if it is Kennedy, then the radio theory still explains how the system may have found him. But if it isn't Kennedy, the implications become much worse. It would mean Silo 1 has access to the communication channel and understands exactly what information Juliet needs to hear. That is a terrifying level of control, and it would fit the larger pattern we've been watching all season. The voice isn't simply reacting to events anymore. It appears to understand people. It knows what Camille needs to hear. It knows how to manipulate Sims. It knows how to influence decisions inside the silo. So why wouldn't it also understand Juliet well enough to use a radio transmission against her? There is another reason I like the radio location theory. It gives Silo 1 a reason to care about the physical separation between the silos. The whole system depends on isolation. If residents from different silos start communicating, that isolation begins to fail. If they start traveling between silos, it fails even faster. And if they can coordinate those movements through radio, the silos stop being isolated communities. They become one connected population. That may be the real threat. Not one person escaping. Not one person discovering another silo. Connection. Because once people know there are thousands of others living under the same system, the psychological foundation of the silos starts to break down. And radio is one of the easiest ways to create that connection. That also gives us a possible reason for the secrecy surrounding Silo 1. If Silo 1 is monitoring the network, then information about the other silos isn't simply hidden from residents. It is being controlled at the communication level. People can be prevented from learning who else exists. Messages can be intercepted. Signals can be located. And potentially, messages can be replaced or manipulated. That is much more powerful than simply locking a door. It means the system can control the information moving between communities. Now, go back to Lucas. His entire character has always been tied to information. He studied the stars when nobody else understood what they were seeing. He decoded Quinn's message. He entered the legacy. He learned that the history of the silos was much larger than the story residents had been given. And now he is one of the people physically crossing the boundary between silos. That makes his use of the radio especially interesting. Lucas has spent the entire series discovering information. Now, the information itself may be what puts him in danger, and that feels very Silo. The characters keep finding new ways to communicate, while the system keeps finding new ways to control what they learn. So, where does that leave the theory? I think the strongest version is slightly more specific than Silo 1 tracks every radio. The better theory is that Silo 1 can monitor radio traffic and use transmissions to locate active transmitters. That doesn't mean every radio call automatically results in an attack. It means the system has another source of information. If someone is transmitting from outside, Silo 1 may suddenly know that somebody is there. If the system already has a map of the silo network and the surface between them, locating the source could tell it which people are moving, which silo they're approaching, and where they are likely headed. That would explain why radio becomes so dangerous precisely when the rebels begin making deliberate trips between silos. And there is one final question I keep coming back to. Why would the system allow radios to exist at all? Maybe because radios were never considered a threat. Maybe their range was deliberately limited. Or maybe the people running the silos always knew that radio communication could be monitored. In that case, the residents have spent generations believing they were using radios to connect with each other, while the system was using those same radios to keep track of them. That would be one of the cruelest details in the entire silo setup. The technology that makes the silos feel connected could also be one of the technologies keeping them trapped. Episode 7 hasn't proven that radio is the mechanism Silo 1 uses to find people, but the timing is too clean to ignore. Juliet crosses the outside and survives. Lucas and Kennedy cross while maintaining radio contact and are intercepted. Then a radio transmission appears at exactly the moment Juliet needs new information. There are still pieces missing. We don't know exactly how Silo 1 would locate a signal, whether it can distinguish one transmitter from another, or whether the final voice was actually Kennedy. Those answers matter, because if the radio really is a tracking system, the rebels have a serious problem. Every time they transmit, they may be telling Silo 1 exactly where to look. And if the final voice was an imitation, they have an even bigger problem. They may have discovered that the enemy isn't merely listening to their radios. The enemy can talk back.